Hello, I'm James Conlon, music director of Los Angeles Opera. Some of you who may be classical music fans will know me as a conductor of symphonic, operatic, and choral music. To those of you who are perhaps not music fans, you may also know something about the work I have been doing in the last 30 years to revive and make known to the world the music and the names of composers who were suppressed during the Nazi regime and whose music is still relatively unknown and sometimes ignored in our modern world. Now, in keeping with my trying to stay abreast of all of the latest Holocaust studies, I've come across this marvelous book, The Last Ghetto, An Everyday History of Theresienstadt by Dr. Anna Hájková. In pursuing these efforts, I think it's very important that we bear in mind in our modern world that the past should not be forgotten. And I think this is a deep dive study into the complexity of this notorious site of suppression and genocide. It's fascinating reading, and I recommend it very highly to you. And I welcome Dr. Hájková now so that you can get to know her and her book.
Welcome everybody again. I'm Randy Schoenberg. For those of you who haven't met me, I was for 10 years the president of the museum. I was acting director for about 1 year and helped design the museum. Most of it is still here. And it's good to be back, and it's good that there are so many programs. I want to thank Jen again for doing a terrific job on programming in the museum. Especially thank her for inviting my friend, Dr. Anna Hájková. We met through genealogy, which is sort of my first love. I don't know if it's yours also, but we came across each other because we both have backgrounds in the same area, which is in the Czech Republic. My connection to tonight's topic is through my mother's grandfather. Zygmunt Seisel was born in Vienna. His father made some money and sort of was able to set him up in a coffee house in the 2nd District in Vienna, right across from the train station. And he stayed there his whole life until 70 years old, at which point he was ordered to the train station and sent to Terezín. This was in July of 1942. He did not last very long in Terezín. He and his wife, who was my great-grandmother's sister, were transported on the second transport from Terezín to Treblinka in October, so two months later, or end of September, sorry, 2 months later. So my connection to Terezín, at least through him, is very brief, but of course I have many other family members who found their fate there as well. And so I've, since as long as I can remember, been aware of Terezín and interested in it. And also interested, as James Conlon said, in music. You can see in the display over there, Holocaust music, the middle panel are two composers. The top one is Victor Ullmann, who we'll talk about a little later, sort of the most famous of the composers in Theresienstadt. He was a pupil of my grandfather, Arnold Schoenberg, who made it here to Los Angeles. Matter of fact, that picture of Victor Ullmann, I think, is the only picture of his in existence, and comes from a birthday album for my grandfather. So feel a little bit connected to him and to the topic that we're going to discuss. So enough about me. We want to hear from, can I call you Anna during this? Is that okay? Or do I have to call
Why would you call me?
Professor Hájková, yeah.
Professor Doctor?
Professor Dr. Hájková, yes. So I can call you Anna. But I first want you to tell the audience and me about your background and how you came to this topic.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I have to say Holocaust historians often go a very dark road. We spend from morning until evening researching traumatic topics. And one of the best advice I was ever given is find a hobby. My hobby is what we call mishpochology, looking for family trees of interesting and maybe not so interesting, but really fascinating Jews and building a family tree. And that's why I really love Gini, because through my research I found some very profound histories from Terezín, where I knew most probably the grandchildren of these people do not know these histories from Terezín. These are kind of faraway sources. So at some point in 2010, I joined Gini.com. And what I really loved about it is that we are all building together one family tree. It's not like everybody building their family tree for everyone for themselves alone and say, put your fingers away from my family tree, but we are all related. And I think that's a very important humanistic gesture. When I visited LA in 2018, I reached out and said, "Dear Mr. Schoenberg, do you want to have ice cream with me?" And since then, we have been hanging out and it's been wonderful. I came to Terezínstadt through my grandparents, through both my paternal grandparents and through my maternal grandparents. On my mother's side, my relatives were Jewish, they were persecuted by the Nazis, and everybody in my family who was deported to Terezínstadt did not come back, which is also an important reason when I was thinking about dedication of the book, that I decided to kind of echo Zdeněk Lederer and dedicate the book to those who did not come back, because I really think Terezínstadt is very often told through the perspective of the survivors, and I wanted to put the majority, 95% of people who did not make it out alive, front and center. But the point of departure for me was when, as a young student in 1999, I went to Israel for the first time, and it was my paternal grandparents who gave me a list of addresses of people to hang out, because my paternal grandparents were non-Jews who were in communist resistance, and what did the group do? They helped Jewish friends who were fellow communists go into hiding. However, some of their friends did not go into hiding, then they were deported to Terezínstadt, and if they survived, they moved to Israel, because of course Israel, especially early years, had a very important left Zionist component. I mean, that has changed in the last few years. And in the late 90s, these people were retired, so they had lots of time, but they were fit, and they were very excited that the granddaughter came to visit, and they showed me around. We went to eat hummus, we drank the wonderful lemonade, we looked at Akko and the desert. And what struck me is that these people in the late 70s shared many stories about Terezínstadt. And what did I know? When I was 20 or 19 about the Holocaust, I knew it was tragic, that I expected people dying and maybe fighting in resistance and dying. I did not expect all these stories about soccer matches, about falling in love, about flirting, about girls coming and offering canned milk. I did not expect people discussing at length, at long car drives. Did we have toilet paper? What did we do without toilet paper? Somebody gave me toilet paper for my birthday, and I was shell-shocked and so surprised at these stories of life, at life emerging out of nothing. And I thought, if I actually want to do the crazy things and go into academia, it would be fascinating to write a case study about Terezínstadt, to offer some insights about life in totalitarian society, and to kind of try to prove Arendt wrong, because of course Hannah Arendt argued that concentration camps and totalitarian society destroys the human nature. And what I heard from the friends of my late grandparents is that the human and the social will continue until the end. So later on, when I was finishing my master's, I decided indeed to go into academia. I wrote my PhD at the University of Toronto. I went to pretty much all the archives around the world. I studied materials in 9 languages. I took way too long to write the PhD, and eventually it came out, and I hope it can be read in twofold way. It can be read by people like my mom or my cousins or my brother, who had family in Terezínstadt, who maybe shared something, but most often did not, because they did not live to tell the story. But also, importantly, it could be read by people who are interested in the human nature, in signs of oppression, and what it does to us as humans, and how people resist and continue to be human. So the book is finished, and you will be the judges.
Yes, it's terrific. I read it 4 years ago, right? So as you're speaking about it, I'm remembering more and more, because your voice, the same voice you just heard, comes through in her narration. So what the book is, at least as I experience it, is a history of Theresienstadt. It's a relatively complete history touching on all the major points, but then there are other aspects that you add to that. And so you mentioned Zdeněk Lederer, for example, and you talk a lot in the book about the sort of master narrative of Theresienstadt. So I think for the audience here, we should start with the master narrative and then talk about what you add to that.
What I will tell you, of course, Czechoslovakia was occupied in 1939, after Germany 1 year prior had annexed the border territories, the so-called Sudeten area. And Terezín in Czech, or Theresienstadt in German, is just at the border. And I like using this image because it shows you the reason why the Germans picked the town as a ghetto is it was a former fortress. It has these fortifications from outside. It was set up at the end of the 18th century as a kind of bulwark of the Habsburg Empire to defend themselves against the Prussians. Now, the Prussians never came, but this is where the Habsburg army would have kind of one of their seats. You would have soldiers, you would have sex workers, and you would have some of the civilians. And this was one of the seats of the Czechoslovak army until 1938, when the Czechoslovak army was let go. So when the Jews were deported here, and we will have just an anniversary in 3 years' time, it's the 21st of November, 24th of November 1941 is the time of the first transport, which is also why we set the date for today. And one of the reasons why it was in eyes of the Nazis to have a good location here is those of you who have visited Terezín and from the conversing with you, I know that quite many of you did, it's next to the Elbe River, it's completely flat. Then about 500 meters to the, wait, I actually have a pointer. Here, you have the border with Germany proper, right? And it will go just like this. So there will be border guards guarding, and then from the outside here, as you see the fortification, you will have the Czech gendarmes, the Czech police guarding from the outside. So there's a number of ways how it makes escaping harder and harder. But sorry, you were saying something.
No, we're asking about just to give an overview of the master narrative of Theresienstadt. So a lot has been written about Theresienstadt. It's not like all the other ghettos and camps that the Nazis put together. It's fascinating in many ways. And so can you tell us, sort of up to you coming along, how do people talk about Theresienstadt?
Yes, absolutely. Theresienstadt is often narrated as the ghetto for Central European Jews. There is this kind of ongoing narrative of respectability in which Czech and German and Austrian Jews were assimilated and therefore they were decent. When you kind of look at the long Central European history of anti-Semitism, it is all about Jews proving why the anti-Semites are wrong. Now, I think many of us in the last 13, 14 months have had some very bitter thoughts about the many anti-Semites living around us and how tiring it is to prove them wrong. But you really see it in Theresienstadt how pretty much everybody who is deported to Theresienstadt has this assimilated Central and Western European background, because it was people from Central and Western Europe, from Czechoslovakia, Germany, Austria, Netherlands, Denmark, Slovakia, and Hungary who were deported here. So the mass narrative tells that in contrast to the ghettos in Eastern Europe, in the occupied Eastern Europe, these people are assimilated. They showed that even though the Nazis always said, okay, the Jews are unable to do manual labor, they only work as lawyers and architects, they actually excelled at manual labor. They produced beautiful cultural production. They took care of the weakest, defined as children. And they kind of proved that out of something horrible, like imprisonment, they can do something meaningful and beautiful. Now, that all is true, but it's also not the whole truth. And some of the stories I think we need to add to the history are the erased histories. What about the elderly in Theresienstadt? And now I have to multitask. The point I want to make on the example of the elderly, the Jewish self-administration in May 1942 learns from the Germans that the Germans will start deporting here people from Austria and Germany. And that these people, unlike people from the protectorate, from Czechoslovakia, will be mostly the elderly. And this is the moment when the self-administration, not the SS, decides that there will be a triage of food rations between the normal workers, the hard laborers, and the non-workers. Everybody above the age of 65 does not have to work, but if you do not work, you will get different food rations. And the food rations for the non-workers, who absolutely in the majority will be elderly, are very, very small. So from the 34,000 people who will have perished in Theresienstadt by the liberation of the Red Army in May 45, almost all of the people who perish in Theresienstadt are elderly. They get very, very small food rations, and I find the drawing of Norbert Stroller quite telling about how it portrays the elderly looking in rubbish for the fields, proślubki it's called, for the potato fields. You do not see them as individuals, you see them just as shapes looking in the garbage. And you can also read the picture in a very different way. You can look at the people who used to be respectable members of the society, people who would have, the subscription to the opera, who would be reading the newspaper, who would be going on holiday to one of the spas, and who, if they got married or got engaged, they would announce it in Právě Tagblatt or in another important broadsheet of the day. And now they are in their 80s and 90s, and they are reduced to very little. And yet they still try to make it out alive. And even if it means giving up on so much of their former dignified life, they try to stay alive, to look for food, because they want to tell the story. And also they want to see their children again, who quite often have emigrated to New York or to Paris or to Amsterdam or to London. And those few of them who make it out alive are often the very first ones who tell the story. So one of the things that I kind of try to push back against the mass narrative is about who does it erase. If we say that in Terezín people took care of the weakest, why is it defined as children and not the elderly, and we have such a high mortality of the elderly? I also asked some questions about the art production, and I think that's something you wanted to also touch on.
Yeah, well, we can talk about the art maybe later. I want to dwell on this a little bit. So there were a lot of discussion in your book about language and the language people spoke, and I think that's a big part of the experience that people have in Theresienstadt, and also impacts the narrative that comes out of it afterwards. So maybe people might be interested in that as well.
Yeah, language is super important. Even though everybody was deported to Terezín because they were racially Jewish, if you so want, people did not speak one common language. And you really see how, for example, for the Czech Jews, everything is about generation. People born before 1900 usually have German as their first language. People born after 1900 will speak Czech, but people coming from the former border regions, such as Opava or Liberec, Stropau or Reichenberg, will be speaking German. But then it is so coded as something kind of nationalistic and wrong to speak German that you have people switching in the last years before the deportations or in Terezín from German to Czech. And you can see it in the diaries that the Czech they write is often not very good. But what about the communication between the Jews from Germany or Austria and Jews, say, from Reichenberg, from Liberec or Opava, or even the Prague Deutsche, the Prague German speakers? It was not about the language people spoke, but about the accent with which people spoke. So what was for me really fascinating was reading the diaries of the Prague German-speaking Jews writing in German, die fürchterlichen Deutschen, die kommen und nehmen uns alles weg, the frustrating Germans, they come and take everything away from us, but they say it, of course, in German. And that was the moment when I came to realize we have all these discussions about the Czech-German ethnicity struggles in Czechoslovakia, from 1880s to 1930s. And it stops being about language in Terezín and it becomes about ethnicity. And the extra layer to it, and I cannot stress it enough, everybody who is sent to Terezín is Jewish. In the eyes of Nazis, they are all the same and they are all the pariahs. But Terezín is a prime example how when people are thrown together, it does not engender common Jewishness. You see over and over the differentiation between the locals, as the Czech Jews, and the foreigners, as the Germans, as the Dutch, and everyone else. And some people will stop and say, why are we having these differentiations? After all, we are all Jews. But the issue of seniority, how long people have been in the ghetto, and who has ties to being at home and who not, is very, very salient. I will give two more examples. I've already touched on my family's history, but not current ties to the Communist Party. There was also an underground Communist Party in Theresienstadt. But in practice, they were pretty much all Czech. The surviving, one of the leaders who survived, Miroslav Kárný, a really important historian of Terezín ghetto, recalled in his memoir that we also had the Dutch comrade, sadly I don't remember his name. And this, what do you remember and what you do not remember, is also really telling. Because if the Dutch guy was really a part of the core group, of course everybody would have remembered his name. The same also applies to much of the Zionist work in Terezínstadt, where some of the really charming German or Austrian Zionists try to make it to the core of the group, but because they are not Czech, they are not really accepted. Some people who are charming, who are good looking, who have great networks, can get accepted to kind of the hardcore of the golden youth in Terezínstadt. And in fact, this jeunesse dorée, the golden youth of Terezínstadt, is a phrase that people are aware in Terezínstadt and they are using it for themselves already at the time. So people are quite aware of the class differences at the time of the ghetto. And that was the question earlier about the mass narrative, and it's after the liberation when the kind of power hierarchies and differences and also the impact on survival starts being a little bit put into the background in the histories of the ghetto.
Let me take a step back, because not everybody like us has spoken all the time about Terezínstadt. Let's give people the basic facts.
Yes, I think that's important. So we have already talked about the location of the ghetto and the fact that it was a former fortress. 144,000 people altogether were deported to Terezín between November 41 up to May 1945. 34,000 people died here. From the beginning on, it was a transit ghetto, so some 87,000, oh, I'm missing a zero, I apologize, 87,000 people were deported to the east, actually not majority to Auschwitz, to Rasiku in Estonia, to ghettos in occupied eastern Poland, to the camps of the Operation Reinhardt, like Sobibor and Treblinka, also to Malý in occupied Belarus, and then from October 42 to Auschwitz. And from those 87,000 who were deported, about 4,000 survived. The old number actually says 3,600, but I've done a fair bit of research on the people deported from the Netherlands, and I cross-checked the record, so I think the estimate needs to be a little bit higher. And because the Red Army only properly stayed in Terezín and thus liberated it in the morning of May 9, 1945, it is really the last ghetto, because of course the end of war in Europe is on 8th of May. We often talk about Lodz Ghetto as the last ghetto, but Lodz Ghetto was liquidated in August 45. August 44. The last thing I want to mention at this drawing, and it's another thing that Randy and I share. I had the good fortune of being married to a wonderful woman who is an architect, and she drew the maps for the book. Of course, every map is always a historical interpretation. The maps that you see in many books before mine are based on the maps drawn by Jewish cartographers in the ghetto. So what my wife and I did is we studied old maps, we spent a lot of time in Terezín walking around and taking pictures. And what I also think was useful for the book, not only do you have a map of Terezín proper, but you also have a map of the surroundings, so you can see where is small fortress on the location, where are the sites of forced labor, where are the so-called West Barracks and South Barracks for the Mega Factory and so on.
So I, again, because my focus is on my great-grandfather's specific period, I think it's important to note that it wasn't just sort of a continuous experience. Anna already mentioned that there was this decision in the summer of 1942 to start deporting people there. So before those deportations, about how many people were living in Terezínstadt as prisoners?
I will take a guess. Well, I don't write about it in the book, but I would say something like 20 or 25,000 people will be in Terezínstadt.
And it was built for how many people to live in?
Well, before the deportations, you will have maybe 6,000 people with the army.
Okay, so normally it makes 6,000 people, there are 25,000. That's before the big deportations?
This is before the big deportations, and this is about 1 square kilometer, which, you know, I like very laboriously counted in square miles, which I know you as audience, you will need square miles, and sorry, I put on the spot. But in September 42, there's 60,000 people living here.
We went from a town that had 5,000 or 6,000 people to 50,000.
60,000.
60,000. There was a mortality rate of 1% per month at the end of the summer of 1942. And then the solution to that was to send she was off in transports of about 1,000 each to Treblinka, Mali Trostnets, later out, Sobibor, later Auschwitz, etc. And I think people need to be aware of, because sometimes people think of this as sort of like a spa, right, a happy camp, but imagine a place where it has 10 times as many people as normal supposed to live there. That's what many people experience there. And I want to then, because we're going to talk about the famous things that people like to talk about, the Theresienstadt, the art, the music, etc. But let's get through the harder things first.
Yes.
Then ultimately, even the sort of core surviving group gets mostly liquidated in the fall of 1944. And can you talk a little bit about that? Because a lot of what you say, the master narrative, comes out of that experience and the people who end up surviving those deportations.
Yeah, that's important, because in fall 44, for all kinds of reasons, the SS is afraid of an uprising. They want to send as many people to be murdered as possible, but they do not quite close the ghetto. And the big deportations in fall 44 are extremely traumatic and different in two ways. First, it's no longer the Jewish self-administration that is putting together the transports. The SS kills the second and reasonably well-liked out of the Jews, Paul Epstein, and they have forced the Jewish self-administration to put together first 2 or 3 transports from the 10, but afterwards they just go and snatch people on the street and put them into transports from the 28th of September until 28th of October 44. Pretty much every day or every other day there is a transport going to Auschwitz. And why do I stress this as super important? For people going to the unknown, about which they don't quite know what it means to go to Auschwitz, but they know it's going to be horrible, and they know that the elderly and the weak will very probably die. It is important to go with your nearest and dearest. And this is something that I kind of also discuss about agency. The decision is who to go on transport, with someone that you met and fell in love, with your parents, with your children, with your communist underground group, with your Chaverim and Chaverot from your Zionist movement. These are the decisions that people decide. And if it's not the Jewish self-administration that puts together the transport and you can apply to go or to be exempt, but it's the SS, you no longer go with these people, and people go as completely broken, people. And often the people who are deported in 444 are members of the Golden Youth. They had it reasonably good. They were the cooks, they were the butchers, they were the bakers, they had access to a so-called kumbal, and there is a beautiful drawing by Eli Leslie about the kumbal, a tiny room of their own. They were able to play soccer, they went to the musical festivities. Sure, they were also bitten by the bedbugs, they lost a lot of weight, they often worried about being deported to the east, but people get used to almost everything. So at the moment when they arrived to Auschwitz, and they knew they were part of the social elite of Theresienstadt, and now they arrived at the bottom, they are beaten up, and so many of them perish. And this is, I want to stress the context in which they say, the tragedy of our generation, and it's a quote from Catalan, is that we have nice memories of Theresienstadt. Because in contrast with everything that comes afterwards, Theresienstadt was really a good place, especially if you were young and had these connections. I want to add one more thing, and that is, until almost the end, people in Theresienstadt do not want to quite acknowledge what is happening in the East. Sorry?
I was going to ask you exactly
Okay.
that. So, no, that's fine. Keep going.
Okay.
Keep going. So what did they know? What
Yeah.
did the Jews know who were being deported? What did the ones who stayed there know? How did the information travel?
Yeah. It's so different from Warsaw Ghetto or Lodz or Białystok, which is much closer to Chełmno or to Treblinka and to other places. And there are some information trickling in, but people develop quite elaborate psychological mechanisms not to acknowledge the horrible news that is trickling in. So, for example, sometimes there is a postcard coming in saying, we have met Uncle Richard. And Uncle Richard is somebody who was deported to Sachsenhausen in 1939 and murdered. And what do the recipients say? Maybe Uncle Richard is still alive. After all, they have met him in Auschwitz. There are reports about gas salt on the trains coming back from Auschwitz, and people do not say people are gassed. People say there will be bad air in the, Auschwitz. Even when the Slovak transports in winter 45 come, and of course the Slovak transports are coming from a place where the two famous Auschwitz escapees, Vrba and Vlcva, have arrived. But because the Slovaks are not somebody who were they personal friends, they do not quite believe that, even though they start worrying. It is only in April 45, with the so-called death that start arriving, that among the death are the former golden elites, the friends, people like Petr Lang, and over they tell the story of what they have witnessed, not only in Auschwitz, but also the death marches of all the children, all the pregnant women, and everybody else being sent to gas chambers. And that's the moment when people in Terezín start believing, but it really comes from 20th April 1945 on.
So I think that gives you a pretty good overview if you didn't already know what Terezín was. But when people talk about Terezín, they talk about sort of the famous stories, which are the artists and musicians, because, as Anna said, there was a semblance of real life that the self-administration, the Jews, they're locked in this prison and they have their own leadership and they set up entertainment, right? Places for people to hear music. There are musicians who go there and they start playing music because they brought it along or they have it in their head. They have a concert series. When I went to Theresienstadt, in the museum that they have there, there's a program from a concert of a pianist who survived. And she played music by my grandfather that she must have brought with her, or someone brought with to the camp. So they had this sort of semblance of reality and an ignorance, willful or not, of what was going on outside, and that allowed them to do some things that have survived to this day. So we can talk about the music, we can talk about the art, because the focus of the exhibit next door is some of the artwork, original artwork that has ended up here in this museum. So it's really, these are things you won't find anywhere else. And so let's talk a little bit about this sort of unreal creativity that was allowed to happen in Theresienstadt.
I think you are better the clicker than I am. If you go forward, there is a drawing of Raphael Schechter. Of course, that's a little less clear. You have from the beginning of drawings, you have cultural production as in theater and cabarets, you have orchestra music and you have singing music. And one of the functions of art is connections to home. And I really like showing it on this drawing. Lotka Borešová, an important Czech artist and also the mother-in-law of the first Czechoslovak Minister of Justice after 1989, Dagmar Borešová, worked for the technical workshop, the graphic workshop where many of the artists worked. And in November 44, after the heart-crushing transport to the east that we have just discussed, does this drawing for her friend who was a frame maker. And she draws a girl jumping through a frame. And the whole thing is called Klid rozvahu, zhluboka dýchat, or stay calm and prudent and breathe deeply. Now, when you see the girl, you do not want to stay calm and prudent. I always say you want to take her pretty elbow and jump with her somewhere. That's amazing. And the drawing is some very salient ways into the bleaching. First, the girl is wearing a simplified version of a Czech national costume. It's this kind of the corset and the red skirt and whatnot, and also the ribbons on the flowers she's carrying in red, white, and blue, right? Red, blue, and white. But there is more to her Czechness. And I like kind of discussing it with Czechs and non-Czechs, and today we are fortunate enough to have both in the audience. The girl is very pretty, if I may say so. How is her, attractiveness expressed? Because we see a lot of her. She has a whole leg that we can see without a stocking. She has the upper bare legs, and she has a deep cleavage. And Czech kind of attraction of sex appeal and of looking good is often quite eroticized. So to the non-Czech viewer, and I've done it many, many times, you look at her and think, she's very pretty, but she's not dressed much. And the Czech viewer looks at her and says, she's very pretty, full stop. So these are some of the subtle ways how kind of belonging to the Czechness is expressed and why this is a meaningful and beautiful gift from a friend to another friend. But there is more about art. It can be a moment of barter. if an artist is starving, he will start producing portraits, and people who are better off, the cooks and the butchers and the bakers, can purchase a drawing. It is also a moment of something that people always used to draw. It's also a very meaningful moment of documentation. And those are perhaps the most iconic pictures of Terezínstadt by people like Frida and Leo Haas and Karel Fleischmann and others, because some of the particularly accomplished artists who worked for the graphic workshop were producing artwork in order to document the horrors of Terezínstadt. They had an in with a former art dealer, Leo Strass, who had a daughter who lived in a mixed marriage and therefore lived in liberty, and he was able to smuggle in the artwork and sell it. Eventually, the SS learned about the artwork that was not only interesting and pretty, such as, Lotka Borešová, but was really documenting the horrors of Terezínstadt, found out about it, arrested the artists, tortured them in the small fortress, and sent them to Auschwitz. And there is one more thing that I wanted to lay here, and I think that is what is so important about Leslie. How do we get to decide what is the canonical art and what is not the canonical art? So if you kind of visit, or if you look at any of the art history books about Holocaust, of course you will find Frida and you will find Leo Haas. But I also want to maybe offer a little provocation. Why is Frida better than Leslie? I do not think one of them is better than the other. Also, I'm a historian, I'm not an art historian. Part of that are people who start collecting the histories of Terezínstadt just after the liberation, people like Zeršek from the Documentation Action, who start creating the first exhibitions about art from Terezínstadt, and they say, these are the key artists, we will bring them to the Prague Jewish Museum, we will put them into exhibition, we will produce the first books about it. And it's only later in the 70s and 80s that kind of the canon starts being a little bit more democratic, and you can have people such as Leslie. And I think you should really check out the exhibition, it's awesome.
The exhibit that you find here was actually the inaugural exhibit in this museum in 2010. Before this museum was rebuilt here, it had been the recipient of a donation of pretty much all of the artwork of this man, Elie Wiesblau, Leslie, who with his wife managed to survive Terezínstadt and moved to Israel. And I think this is an important part of what you're saying, there was a lot of art created, but not for the same artists, not for the same audience, I'm sorry. So whereas the card you did was maybe for a friend, this might have been for an art dealer, the Wiesblau Leslie ones were just for his wife. So what he did was he took sort of typical things that happened, or iconic things that happened in the ghetto, drew a little picture, and then handed them to his wife and told her to destroy it, because he would write little funny captions on it, sometimes insulting the Germans, sometimes insulting the administration, the Jews in the ghetto. It's unfiltered. It's just a marital communication between husband and wife. She cut out the captions and hid the artworks, and both of them survived. And they took them out, and so he then redid them in larger formats. So when you go in there, you'll see the small ones are the original ones done in the ghetto. He was part of the art department and had access to materials. The larger ones are the recreations with the old captions added on. And we put together a catalog, which I can recommend to all of you. I think it's for sale over there. That our former archivist, Vladimir Melamed, put together. And I asked a survivor who you knew when you were in Toronto, Vera Schiff. She just passed away in the last year. And she was one of the survivors of the camp and written quite a lot about it. So I can recommend that book to you because it records, other than the Red Cross visit, which is another famous episode, and Wiesblau was out of Terezínstadt for a month or two and missed that. Every one of the sort of major events in Terezínstadt is recorded in these little drawings that he did for his wife. And it's, of course, a much different thing, as you said, than the sort of more painterly, artistic things, and also another thing altogether from the children's work.
And if you go back, we have Leslie and the Three Magi of Terezínstadt. And I love this drawing with like a fierce love. Because of course, it is incredibly ironic. It's like Tři králové, like three magi. Why would you call the butcher, the cook, and the pastry chef as like the three bosses, it shows that these people are the big bosses in Terezín. They have access to food, and with that they are able to purchase better housing. They have completely different conditions. I've also published a fair bit about sexual martyr in the Holocaust in Terezínstat. A relative of mine worked as a baker in Terezínstat. The bakers at the end of the shifts would receive an extra piece of bread. And he told me when we ended the shift and left the bakery, there would be women waiting for us offering sexual services in exchange for the bread. But Leslie goes an extra step, especially when you look at the guy on the right. He looks quite saliently Jewish, not in a particularly kind way. So he's offering these layers of criticism that there are people who are Hebs, and there are many people, and you see it very movingly in the exhibition next door, who have nothing. So even though his situation as a young Czech guy was reasonably good in Terezínstat, he lived to tell the story, he actually is offering a very powerful critique to the power asymmetries in the ghetto.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things I find interesting about these artworks and cultural items, including the music, is that you have to, not you have to, but you can witness them and appreciate them without knowing anything. But if you understand the background and what the audience was, it sometimes completely inverts what you're looking at. The example I would give is Victor Ullmann, again, the most famous of the composers in Terezínstat. He wrote an opera called The Kaiser from Atlantis, and it was performed at LA Opera by James Conlon also. And it's very good, it's very famous. But most people, when they hear it, they think of what we know as the end of their story, right? That they were all going to die, it was so tragic. The story itself is death goes on strike, and the king ultimately has to offer himself up to get death to come back and start letting people die because everything runs away. And it's very tragic from our perspective, knowing how the story of Ullmann ended. But when he's writing it, he doesn't know the end of his story, right? And if you understand that, you look at it in a completely different way.
And I think here I want to step in and say what is so important about changing the perspective. When you look at the majority of Holocaust historians, like academics like me, because I am an academic historian, that's what I do, I write footnotes. They look at perpetrators, they ask, why did the Germans murder? Jewish Holocaust historians such as Shaul Friedlander, who for many years taught here at UCLA, or Alexander Garbarini, or myself, we asked about experience of the victims. So we do not read the history through the prisma, eventually everybody will be murdered. I'm interested in somebody who will fall in love, or steal a piece of bread, or draw this drawing, and then tomorrow will be deported to Auschwitz and murdered. But I am not reading that through the fact that they are already dead. I want to know their lives, their hopes, their desires, their fears. I want to get through their head. And I think there's also an ethical component to it, not to be asking about the perpetrators, but to be asking about the victims.
I think that's a perfect opportunity to segue into a preview of your next book.
Yes.
So if you can tell everybody what you're working on.
Yeah, I am this term at the University of Michigan at the Frankel Center writing a new book about same-sex desire in the Holocaust. And in this project, I look at Jews persecuted as Jews who engage either consensually or violently, or they identified already before the war as LGBTIQ. Some of the people are coerced into these relationships and of course do not identify as gay. And it does not necessarily influence why they are persecuted, but it's a very important part of the experience. Much of it is on sexual violence, much of it is on homophobia. Some people, it also gives the hope and the strength to survive. I am very lucky because I'm already second time invited this year to this museum. I think it was in June that I showed a play about a lesbian Holocaust survivor who survived Terezínstat and who met her girlfriend in Terezínstat. I guess the foil to the hopeful story of a lesbian here coming of age in the Holocaust is the story of Hambo, who is also drawn by Erich Lichtblau. Hambo, or Harry Heyman, was a Berlin Jewish female impersonator who fled from the Nazis via Finland to Denmark, toured the world, also the States, as a female impersonator and clown the circuses, and eventually was captured with the 600 other Jews from Denmark and deported to Terezínstadt in October 1943. And here Hamburg continued acting as female impersonator. Now, what I find interesting about the drawing, and I want to allow you to read it with me a little bit more, is sure, you look at the drawing and you see a bunch of people watching a female impersonator, and it's clear the person in the middle is a female impersonator. You do not take them for a woman. And it's done in a number of ways that I read as homophobic, because the other people around him are clearly laughing, but when you look at the guy kind of to the right of his ear, he's looking back like this and he's laughing at him. He's not laughing with them. There is also these kind of big wrinkles at Hamburg's forehead, and the red lips are kind of not something that you laugh about the female impersonator, but you are laughing at them. And that's something that we have often in the testimonies about Hamburg, who are othered as a kind of somebody who is gender deviant, who is disturbing, who is different. And that's one of the stories that we know from scholarship of people like Enza Eschebach and Ulrike Jans, how often people survive the Holocaust. They often witness same-sex desire around them. Sometimes it was sexual violence, but sometimes it was romantic. And always these histories are histories full of disgust. And this is a difficult thing to come to terms when survivors, people who we honor and take extremely seriously as we should, watch people engaging in same-sex intimacy or kissing or holding hands and saying that this is disgusting. And we are in 2024, we should really be alone. And something that I came to realize, these are histories that for a long time have been erased. And I think the question we need to be asking, why have these histories been erased? And what do we gain by putting these histories back? I don't necessarily think we get a completely different history, but we get a fuller history. In the last 5 or 10 years, people have been asking about black victims of Nazism, about Sinti and Roma, about disabled people, also about the so-called social or criminal victims. The fact that for many people, having access to intimacy, even if it means same-sex intimacy because they are in homosexual camps, is a really important means of survival. It can also be means of sexual barter. For some people, I want to be very clear, it's an experience of sexual violence, but all of that is part of the messiness and ambivalence that was experienced of the Holocaust. And I think we need to take it on board and look at the history warts and all, and that's what I'm doing.
Yeah, no, I find it interesting and important also to, because many people want to sort of describe the Holocaust in a very superficial way, I think. And of course, people are people, no matter where they are and what circumstance they are. And I think your book, is the Theresienstadt one that I've already read, really captures that, and not in a way that is demeaning or insulting at all. But you have to recognize that people behave in certain ways, whether they're in an office in Century City or whether they're in Theresienstadt. I'm reminded, there's a story that's not in your book. It was my only criticism of the book, I think I told you. Again, going back to Vera Schiff, who was the co-author of the Last Ghetto book that you can buy there. She has, in one of her books, she was a teenager, late teen, 17, 18, something like that, in the beginning in Theresienstadt, and she got work as a nurse for a doctor. And your story reminded me of this because there was a woman who came in who was pregnant, and that was a crime in Theresienstadt. You were not allowed to be pregnant, and you were not allowed to give birth, and if there was a baby born, everybody involved would be executed. So she came to the doctor, and the doctor turned to Vera, who was, again, a teenager, and said, after the baby was born, said, "I'm a doctor. I'm not allowed to kill the baby, but you have to kill this baby, otherwise we'll all be executed." And he forced her in that sort of position of power to do this. And it's something she writes about in her novel, so in her book. It's, again, these things happen, and if we skirt around it and not talk about it, we don't really understand how horrible it was in the Holocaust. It would just sort of float on the upper level. And so that's why I think it's so important that you do go into these specific, difficult for us maybe stories and tell them and talk about the power dynamics, talk about what the background is, what these people who are like rats forced into a maze, not to compare Jews to rats, but like, you know, how in experiments you can put a mouse in a maze, right? So the Jews are trapped, and they don't know they're trapped, and then they behave in certain ways that sometimes bring what they were like beforehand into play, and I think it's just part of the overall picture to learn about these people, why they're all victims, even if they were perpetrators inside the ghetto, they're all victims, and they're all put in this terrible position, but that doesn't mean we can ignore what happens. And anyway, I think your book really tremendously brings that into full view, and I recommend it to all of you. Should we open it up to questions now? I think we've talked quite a bit, and there's a question to start in the back.
Really touch on the Germans using it as like a public relations thing at all. I mean, why did you talk about? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So the fact that the Germans sent here 2 visits of Red Cross in 43, the German Red Cross, and in 44 the International Red Cross. Those are 2 quite well-known aspects. Of course, we also have the propaganda movie shot here during summer 44. There is a documentary movie from Jewish settlement area. That is all well known, and as we discussed with Randy before, it's part of the mass narrative. But if you want to find out what was important to people during the ghetto, you find out that sure, they will be quite fascinated by the fact that there is a propaganda movie being shot, or that there's beautification for the Red Cross, and also to beautify the ghetto. Some 7,500 people are sent to Auschwitz in May 44, and that is a very real impact. But the impact for the people who remain in the ghetto is relatively minor. And here I go back to my point about victim experiences and Jewish-centric history of the Holocaust. I did not want to tell Terezín from the perspective of the perpetrators. And also it's been done before. Hage Adler partly tells the story, and his book is tremendous.
I have my own view. Kurt Geron is the sort of director of this propaganda film, and sometimes I think we don't think of it from his perspective, right? So he's a filmmaker who's given this task. It gives him purpose. It's something he's good at. He wants to do it, and everybody is sort of forced to clean up. But I think partly they want to also, because this is a film that we don't know what the intended use was going to be. We don't know what they thought the intended use was. But that film could not have been shown back in the country, in the places where these Jews were from, because it would give a lie to what the Nazis were telling everybody, which is the Jews are vermin, they're horrible, they're awful, they're disgusting, right? And here they are as real people, playing violin, playing soccer, being normal, right? So in a way, I think the Jews who are taking part in this saw it as their own defiance of that view, right? We're normal people. You talked about it in the beginning. They're trying to prove constantly that we do not deserve to be treated like this.
Yeah, and if I may, when I was starting with the PhD, there was this actually quite an excellent documentary movie about Kurt Geron that came out called Prison of Paradise. And it does exactly the argument that Randy was just saying. Kurt Geron was first and foremost a filmmaker. And people will continue in really the habitus in the profession that they do. I have a whole chapter about medicine and physicians in Terezínstat, and what I found over and over, for physicians, Terezínstat was a medical problem. For the Jewish bureaucrats, Terezínstat was an organizational problem. For the artists, it was something that could be artistically depicted, and for Kurt Geron, it was something that people continue doing. It is really deconstructive for human dignity to be sent somewhere as a dirty Jew, and people cling on to their sense of value through their profession.
More questions? I think there was more. Yes?
I have 2 questions. Number 1, did anyone ever escape from Terezínstat? And number 2, did belonging to one of the organizations, like the communists or the Zionists, help you survive? Or?
Yeah, totally. So yes, people could escape from Terezínstat, and when you think about the first slide that we had, you also have not only the above grounds, but you have a lot of tunnels underneath. So once you know the tunnels underneath, it is actually not so super difficult to escape. people try not to escape because they know that SS will hold their friends and their relatives accountable and will torture them or will send them to the east. So the people who escape are largely members of two groups. First, people with Gentile relatives who were deported without their family and they escape back to their parents because the Nazis deport children from mixed marriages that are members of the Jewish community on their 14th birthday. They go to Terezínstadt without their younger siblings and without mom and dad. And those kids often try to escape. I mean, often they are also caught and sent back and tortured. And the other group who escape are members of resistance units who are deported on their own. So someone about whom my late grandmother, who was a historian herself and wrote a lot about Jewish communists, looked at somebody who goes without his resistance unit because they are all non-Jews, and he escapes, makes his way to Slovakia, and is eventually killed among the partisans. And I will segue to the second part of the question. We know that both the Zionists and the communists tried to protect their own. In the 6th chapter of the book, I look at the logic of the deportations, and we know that the 300 members of the communist group, they had a relatively high-ranking member of the self-administration who was on the transport committee. And the way how he tried to get them exempt is that he learned all of them 300 names by heart. And when the Great Transport Commission was going through the list of everybody in Terezínstadt, and people were trying to appeal, saying this guy works for me, he's indispensable, everybody was ranked through the department according to the dispensability and indispensability, and please think all that in quotation marks. Del Encanto, that was the name of the undercover communist in the Great Transport Committee, would try to always argue for the 300 communists why they are indispensable. And that worked as far as these people were deported relatively late, and therefore from the 300 people from the communist underground group, a relatively high proportion survived. But also most of the communists were young and childless, and I do not need to tell you that that was your best chance of surviving if sent to Auschwitz.
Maybe last question?
My father was on the last transport to Theresienstadt. It actually got bombed on the way and death marched there. And very soon after he arrived, he was liberated and stayed there for some number of months. Do you know anything about what life was like in the camp after the liberation and how people got from there to wherever they were going next?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I was hoping somebody would, I know quite a bit about it, and I decided not to write about it because I don't want to write an Uber book. And there is lots of material. So basically, Terezínstadt after the liberation becomes a little bit like a DP camp until the end of August 45. The Dutch Jews are picked up relatively late and brought by buses to the Netherlands. The Czech Jews, pretty much all of them go home, as the Slovak go. But who stay behind are the sick people, the elderly people, and especially Jews from Germany and Austria. There is a great book about the Jews in Austria after the liberation by my friend Betsy Antony, and she looks basically how the founding chapter of post-war Austrian Jewry are the first buses that eventually at some point in July 45 make their way from Terezínstadt to Vienna. So in the beginning, Terezínstadt has a typhoid epidemic that was brought by people on the death marches, and Terezínstadt is quarantined. The Red Army does not get anyone in or out, so that the whole surrounding does not get sick. The Red Army is actually much more helpful in fighting the epidemic than the Czech Red Cross that has physicians who are slightly anti-Semitically challenged. And the Czech, the Terezínstadt survivors are not blind to that, so they're very outspoken about it. And I know some of you who visited Terezín Memorial are aware of, let's say, some of the problematic Czech narratives that kind of try to put the Czech anti-Semitism undercover. I have the good luck that even though I'm Czech, I do not have to work in the Czech Republic, so I don't have to take the Czech sensibilities into account. That is, if I don't Google myself the discussions in the Czech media. But, you know, we can criticize Poland for what we want, but the Polish audiences have had some really rough discussions about the Polish complicity in the Holocaust. We haven't had that in the Czech Republic yet. If we jump to June 45, by then pretty much everybody has healed. People may be recovering very slowly. If you had typhoid, you lose a lot of weight, you are dizzy, you forget a lot of things, you know, about the survivors kind of making their way slowly home and trying to figure out who is who, because it can take half a year until you completely recover. And many people of the self-administration stay behind and try to organize the return of everyone. And kind of hero of the story is Jiří Vogel, the last out of the Jews who took over just before the liberation from Benjamin Murumishtan, who stays behind until August 45. You know, if you are liberated, your first thought is to go home, get your apartment back, try to get your job back, get your ID back, and get on your feet. People want to find out if their relatives are still alive, maybe they want to see their husband or wife, and try to have children. That's kind of the first things. To stay in Terezín and try to organize that everybody can go on their way as dignified as possible. And what also the self-administration does, and I think that goes to the earlier point about people's jobs, they write letters of recommendation. They write letters of recommendations for each other, saying this guy or this lady worked for 3 years in the graphic workshop, they were responsible, reliable, excellent artists, and this is basically my proof that the years in Terezín were not wasted. Maybe, sorry, one more thing that I found so fascinating, and it's back to the physicians. Physicians in summer 45 sit down and write the memories of Terezín and submit it to medical journals because they do not want to have all the years in Terezín in vain.